Hi guys, so today I want to talk about the dragon setup for black, and this is mostly for beginners, but really anybody can play it. And it's really a setup in the sense that you can play black's moves no matter what, and black really has to play something like c5, put the pawn on g6, fianchetto the bishop, and that's already the dragon setup. So why is it called the dragon? Because a long time ago, some guy was looking at this pawn chain, basically something like this, with a pawn on g6 and let's say a bishop on g7 and a white bishop anywhere, and he looked at this pawn chain right over here for black and he said, wait a second, that looks almost like a dragon and like a constellation of the dragon in the sky. And he said, wow, I think I'll call this the dragon opening. And so the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense was created. So basically this is the dragon bishop. This is the piece you value the most. It's so important, you don't want to give it up for the rook in some cases, because sometimes this bishop is stronger. And all of your pieces will have great squares to go on. For example, this knight is gonna come to c6, so let's say white castle somewhere, we put him on c6. The other knight is gonna go to f6, and of course we're gonna castle short, because castling long is a bit scary considering there is already a pawn that's moved to c5 and not really protecting your king on the queen side if the king decides to castle there. So then, the other pieces like this bishop, well, if you have a chance, I would probably trade him off for that knight, and I'll show you guys why, because we really love this square, and if possible, all of our pieces want to control it, if possible. Now, let's say he pushed the pawn up already, then we're gonna attack the square with our bishop and knight, but if we can take it for ourselves, that's even better. For example, let's say they go there, right? So then I'll probably move this knight away so I can control the amazing d4 square with the dragon bishop and my knight from c6, and this bishop is really helping because let's say they even take off my bishop and I trade him off for that knight. That's one less piece to worry about when my knight comes to that amazing d4 hole for white. And now I'm attacking the queen has to go back to defend the pawn, my bishop has a great square, my knight has a great square, and now my other knight will also find great squares to support his friend on d4. And so that's what happens if they don't push for d4, if they play what we call the closed type of Sicilians and they don't trade on d4. But what happens if they do trade on d4? Where do the pieces go then? Well, let's go from the beginning and we'll take a look. The whole point of the Sicilian and the dragon setup that comes from it is that we're not letting them take the whole front of the center, right? We're not letting them have the e4 and d4 square. The two front teeth are not gonna stay there for long because I'll break them up. And so let's say white plays knight f3. I put my pawn on d6 because I want to take out the knight, but I don't like him kicking away my knights right away. So pawn to d6, and let's say they take the center with their pawn and are happy to trade it for my c pawn. Well then, I'm gonna trade it off right away, right? Because flank pawns are a bit less valuable than center pawns. And so now I have two center pawns and they only have one. The bad thing is I am a bit down on space, so space is totally in white's control here, and they control the center, good for them, they have a nice knight 24, you know, that's all great. But in exchange for that, I get my own good things, like for example, I get to attack his center, and now if he defends the center, now there is my dragon setup again with the dragon pawn chain and the dragon bishop coming next turn. For example, let's say he defends the knight, he's trying to castle queenside this time. Let's see what happens there. Well, first we bring out a dragon bishop, and if I can, I usually want to bother their bishop. Like let's say they play something useless, maybe something like queen d2. Well, they didn't stop me from knight g4, and I'm gonna trade off that bishop as soon as I can, because then our dragon will have no opposition on the dark squares, and black is already better. And if the bishop decides to run, well, I can bother the bishop so that he ends up in the middle of nowhere looking at my pawn on d6, so that's not good for him either. And he's free to go to f4, for example, like this, but I don't think he really wants to get forked with his knight, so I'm very happy if he moves that bishop, and if not, I'll just trade him off with my knight. So then you'll say, how can white stop the trade of knight for the bishop? Well, then white can play something like pawn to f3 and say, nope, you can't come here, and I'm supporting my center. And that's good for him, you know, that's his right, it's a free country, but now I'm gonna make sure castling long is dangerous for him. So first, we take out all our pieces, the knight's gonna come here. The bishop usually comes there unless he can come to e6. So if this knight is gone for some reason somewhere else, then I'll put the bishop on e6 to scare off his king from even considering longside castling. But if the knight is here and is being annoying, I don't want to trade him off because then the bishop counteracts my dragon bishop. So I don't want to trade it, I just want to leave it there because I'm very happy if they decide to trade. Now I have the b file, say hi to their b pawn, I have 3 pawns that can support the center, so I can push for like d5 right now. I don't usually want to push e5 because my dragon bishop will feel really offended. He'll say, why are you blocking me? What did I do to deserve a pawn looking in my face? And it's my own pawn. That's not very nice. So that's why we don't really push e5 here. If anything, we push for d5 in the dragon. And then if they don't take, well, they continue with what's called the Yugoslav attack. So let's say they're trying to castle long because they want to get the pawn storm rolling right after I castle short, and we have opposite side castling. Well, let's take a look what happens then, right? We're gonna castle, and I won't show you guys everything, all the ideas for black, because that will take hours, but I'll show you black's main ideas. So basically, if they let you, you should always play d5, because when the center opens up and the dragon bishop looks down that diagonal, it's gonna be really unpleasant for white trying to fight off our bishop. If he can, he will trade that bishop off with bishop h6, but usually we won't give him much time to do that. So, for example, here, let's say white tries to trade off my bishop. I'm thinking something like even bishop takes e3, doubling up their pawns, then moving away my rook. But basically, I'm not too scared of them trading off right now, because most people, they see a free pawn, they say, what if I take a free pawn? And then they open up the whole board for my bishops. And now this bishop's coming here, that bishop's coming there. I have the open b file, I have the open c file. All my pieces are placed in the right job. So then my queen will go somewhere like c7 and offer up a rook, because if they decide to take the rook, they may regret it, considering we have a discovered attack on both checkmate and the queen. So we're gonna get the queen back, right? So if they don't take it, then I'm just gonna have the open b file, the open c file, and all my pieces have their jobs. Right now, let's take a look at what if white doesn't let us play d5. So instead of castling, they have a few other options, right? Let's say they play bishop c4, and that's their main move. Well, in the dragon, this is probably the scariest line you'll have to face as black in this setup, but basically the bishop is still very strong, so we shouldn't be too worried, and we can bother that bishop and we can be really annoying. For example, some people, they try to go for rook b8, and then after the trade of knights they play b5 and a5, and that's called the Chinese dragon. And then on the other hand, the classical dragon, you take out the bishop to d7, and when they castle long, you give them something to worry about, like the discovered attacks on their own bishop. And if they try pawn storming in g4 or h4, I usually want to fight with h5 to make sure they don't go any further, and I want to make sure they never open up this h file, because their idea is very simple. They play h4, h5, take, and bishop h6, after which they trade off my favorite dragon bishop and checkmate me with the help of the queen rook battery. And we don't really like that, do we? So we have to attack them first. So here already my discovered attack is gonna be really scary, and even if they move the bishop back, usually our knight's coming in the middle, so let's say something like g4 happens, we can play the knight to c4, and that's our favorite square in the open Sicilians, where we fork their queen and bishop and we say you have to give us at least the bishop pair. Then my other queen is coming to a5 and my other rook is coming to c8, so I can finally sacrifice my rook for that knight of theirs. So let's say they play something like h5, h4, and then I play h5. And then they're trying to get their attack across and I bring in my pieces. Well, my knight actually holds the kingside quite well, which I can't really say for their knight because now I'm gonna get rid of him. Let's say the king goes there. I'll bring in my other rook, and let's say they do something slow. So let's say they take my pawn on h5. Already I'm considering just sacrificing that rook for the knight so I can destroy the king's roof and start attacking him with the help of my rook, with the help of my queen. You know, all the pieces are coming in. So this is just fantastic for black. Okay, so remember, in the Sicilian, we really like the c4 square for the knight. We really like our dragon bishop and we value him above anybody else. He's really our favorite piece. And we love the half-open c-file, which allows us to generate pressure on both the knight on c3, which was there before, and the pawn behind, because if the knight ever leaves, I ask this guy a question, and when he goes away, especially if my queen's somewhere else, I take the pawn on c2. So the king is really not feeling that comfy today. So hopefully you guys can use the dragon setup, which is characterized by this dragon bishop and very often the other bishop, which is helping him cut the board in half. Hi guys, so now that we know the dragon setup for black and we're ready to play it against any e4 opening, basically putting the pawns in c5, d6 and a pawn on g6, getting our bishop dragon out, the question is how would it really look like in a game? So that's what this game is meant to show you, and we're gonna take a look at Anand, who was a former world champion, playing against another former world champion by the name of Mr. Kasparov. So Garry Kasparov in this game decided to go for the dragon setup and completely destroyed White's attack and then really demolished the White kingside. So let's take a look at how that looks like so we can use those attacking ideas in our game. So we start off with king's pawn opening and Garry says, can I take a little bite off your center? White says, only if I can take a little bite back next move. And so black puts the pawn on d6 so as to get the knight to f6 and get the dragon bishop out. Some people first take out the dragon bishop with g6 and bishop g7, but the problem there is that white can play both d4 and c4 and get such a big chunk of the center and control everything and make sure we can never get both d5 and b5, which are moves that we really like to get in this opening. So let's take a look at how the normal dragon looks like with a pawn on d6. So this is the classical dragon, okay? White says, can I open things up and play the open Sicilian? Black trades up the central pawn for his own flank pawn, and white gets a nice knight in the middle. We attack his pawn, white defends his pawn and says, no thank you. Black says, can I get my dragon bishop out, please? And white says, let's start castling queenside so I can pawn storm you better. And black says, I really don't mind, because even if you do pawn storm me, I can pawn storm you, and I can use that open c-file. Let's see how that looks like. The queen starts to make a battery, getting ready to trade off the dragon bishop, and black says, no, no, because if you decide to trade off right now with bishop h6, then I will take, queen takes back, and say bye to your knight. And that's why this knight is so good on c6. White says, I want to make sure that you can't go to knight g4, so I'm gonna put a pawn there and defend my own center. Black says, what if I castle and get ready to be pole-stormed on the queen side? And white takes out the bishop, making sure that the center doesn't open with d5, because it's not very pretty for white when those bishops open up and start firing on those long diagonals. Black modestly takes out the bishop to make way for the rook, and white says time to pawn storm, time to attack as soon as possible before I even castle. And in this game it proved to be a little mistake. By itself it's not that bad because you can always castle next move, but most people they castle first, and we'll see why in a second. For example, white never got to castle. And of course black says, no, you can't cross the equator, no, I'm not letting you soften up my roof and use that hook on g6 to open up your rook, no, I'm not gonna let you do that, because I'm stubborn. And the bishop runs away, and this is like a prophylactic move, knowing that later on this bishop doesn't feel very safe there or very comfy, because the knight's coming in, the rook's coming in, and somebody's gonna hurt that bishop, so we just move him back where he's a bit safer. Now, some people would just get the bishop pair with knight a5 and trade off the bishop, but Mr. Kasparov had other plans in this game. So he brings up all his reinforcements, brings in the rook on the c-file, and black takes because black wants, white takes because white wants black to trade off with the bishop and then close up his own roof, and so that he can trade off that annoying bishop and live happily ever after. But Gary takes with his pawn and says, I don't care that my rook is on the c-file, I'll change it to the b-file. Feel free to take this pawn on a7 and get your bishop trapped with c5. I'm all for that, you know, feel free to take that pawn. And even if you don't take that pawn, now I control the d5 square, which is usually really annoying for black, considering that the knight goes there, and even if the black knight takes, then white pawn takes, and the e7 pawn becomes soft and a backwards pawn, and it becomes hard to defend. So we like to have control over the d5 square, so that this knight doesn't have any dreams in the future. And right away, white tries to get rid of the dragon bishop. But because he gave away the central knight and he still didn't castle yet, we can give him something to worry about. For example, how is that bishop feeling? Even if you do trade off my bishop, then the other bishop of yours is not feeling too well, because even if he goes to a4 and does run away, well then, first of all, he does nothing. Second of all, I could trade him off and put a knight on the rim, and that knight really doesn't want to be on a4, he wants to be attacking. And here there is no attack on the black king, who's completely safe as long as there is a knight protecting him, right? There is no rook to give him anything to worry about yet, because white never castled, right? So let's take a look at how things went. The bishop said, what if I just block you? And what if I put a bishop in your way so that you can't push the pawn up? Well, then the queen comes in and says, what about the b2 weakness that you let me attack by opening up the b file? And now my rook can also join the party. And then it's not so easy to defend this pawn, because even if you do castle, well, consider that my rook is coming to b8. If you play something like castle, rook to b8 and b3, look at those dark squares. And then I'm already threatening queen a3 check, and I'm also threatening something like bishop takes and say bye to your knight. Perhaps we'll even take your bishop first, something like this, and then start invading. You see, so that's no fun for white, which is why Mr. Anand decided against castling long. And he said, maybe I'll keep my king in the middle just a bit longer, but that was all the time Gary needed to checkmate. So let's take a look at the final attack. Bishop c4 and queen to b6. How are you defending that pawn? And white said, first of all, I'll trade off that bishop of yours so you don't decoy my queen anywhere. And then after that, I'll just defend normally and make sure my bishop's reinforced, make sure that my king is not gonna get under attack, because he can always castle kingside and maybe hide on h1. Well, black said, What if I trade out that bishop of yours? And what if I still play c4 when the bishop is gone? And what if I open up the c file again? And if you do trade, then look at my f file, because maybe I can use that in the future with the idea of d5 coming in as well. So Anand was so scared, he said, maybe I should put a knight there instead, and maybe I should just centralize, right? But now Gary takes with the bishop and leaves white with a very hard choice, because you take with the bishop, this pawn's coming here, forget about castling kingside. And if you take with the pawn, which is what Vichy did in the game, well then, what is that guy doing here? What's the bishop on c4 doing? Staring at two walls of his own color? And look at my excellent knight, who's attacking that basically isolated pawn. And look at your king, where is he casting? Is he gonna castle short? Well then, how is his rook doing? How are his dark squares doing? Not really well. And if you do take, which is what white basically has to do, well then our king is castle and your king is not, which means time to blow up the center, which is exactly what Gary does. Blows up the center, asks the bishop some questions like, if you take me, now first we'd probably play something like rook to d8, ask your bishop another question, and then ask him and the last question that he'll have to look at, because now there is no way to save the bishop. And so these central files are just too strong for black, right? And the bishop doesn't want to take, which means he has to go back home, and he doesn't like going back home because that gives black all this space. And should we take this pawn back? Not really, because we have to make sure the king doesn't castle first, and we're getting ready to implant that nail into his house. That annoying nail, just hammer it in there. And white says, I really don't like that nail. I want to make sure that nail stays exactly where it is on c4, and so I can take it later on. Because if white does take, you could say, what happens then? Well, now dark squares with queen to b2, but also you're not castling either way. And probably something like d takes c and rook to d8 looks really scary. If you push, that's totally fine. Now just get the e file instead, looking at your king and bishop. So let's see how the game ended. Basically, white said, don't put your nail in there, and black said, what if I ask your bishop some questions? And would you like to take my pawn to double up and help me double up my rooks and make a battery? Well, white took, black took back, and now here is the battery anyways. It's coming no matter what. The king is running for his life because he doesn't like the rook looking at him. And here is the battery. Everything's in the right places. Not like these guys who are nowhere to be seen. You see, white forgot to castle and white forgot to attack because he never got the time. And now he'll get punished for it because the bishop tries to run away. Well then, we'll just get rid of their bishop. And then this beautiful blow at the end. Knight to e4, threatening knight g3 fork, threatening queen f2 if the queen goes away, and then saying, feel free to take my knight. It's a gift from the bottom of my heart, because if you decide to take, you can't go there. You'll have to run to e2 where I can skewer your king and queen, or maybe you'd like to run to e1 where my rooks will just dominate. I have two rooks, you have two bystanders, right? So that are doing nothing. And if the king decides to run away, I'll take the bishop and just be dominating there. Or if the bishop decides to run away, well, that's gonna be the last time he ever moves, because next move I'll take him off the board, probably winning the queen with him. So it's complete domination from black's perspective in this dragon variation. So hopefully you guys can play the dragon just like Kasparov. You see, he liked the bishop, but he allowed the dragon bishop to be traded off so that he can attack the white king who never got to castle in this game. And all the other pieces were so good. He put a lot of pressure on the c file, he put a lot of pressure on the bishop, who was unsure where to go because he just kept getting kicked back and forth from c4 to b3 to c4 to e2. And so we bullied the bishop until he's got nowhere to go, just like the white king.